Our next speaker is Devorah Manekin. She's from the International Relations Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research focuses on contentious politics, including political violence, nonviolent resistance campaigns, and intergroup relations. And her talk is on the politics of allyship.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're all to the microphone. Oh, this, okay, better? Well, okay, I'll try to wake you up a little with lots of graphs and quantitative analysis. Thank you to the organizers for this fascinating conference. It's a unique experience for me to be among colleagues from the humanities and really learn a lot. So thank you. Also for the Israelis in the room for taking a break from nonviolent resistance to hear about nonviolent resistance. The paper that I'm presenting today, let me just time myself here, is part of a larger project on nonviolent resistance of ethnic minorities. And the project is co-authored with Tamar Mitz at Columbia University, Yael Zaira at Syracuse University. And the project really stems from the unprecedented rise that we've all seen in mass protest movements around the world. I put in a picture just on the slides just yesterday from our local protest here, but of course this is happening globally on a very large scale for over a decade now. And along with the rise in protest, there's also been a rise in the study of protest. So specifically in the discipline that I come from, political science, international relations, there wasn't really much work on nonviolent resistance. The work was mostly normative and political theory. But in the past few years, this is just showing you how many articles have been published over the past 20 years on this topic in empirical political science work. And you can see that there's more and more work that's being published on this topic. And I say this because there's one main finding that's emerged from this work that's in the title right here. And that is that nonviolent campaigns are far more successful than violent campaigns in achieving their goals. Some of you might have heard this. It's actually been talked about quite a bit in the context of the Israeli protest. Erica Chenoweth, who's responsible for this finding, has a TED Talk on the question on this issue. And we know that nonviolence is empirically more successful than violence statistically. And that continues even as in the past couple of years, the overall success of nonviolent campaigns has declined quite precipitously, but it retains its advantage over violent resistance, or really armed resistance is what this literature is talking about. And why is that? The theory that's offered to explain the nonviolent advantage is what's called a mobilization advantage or a participation advantage. The idea is that nonviolence is more popular, people will support it more. That means that more people will join compared to violent resistance. Supporters of the status quo are more likely to defect. And this is important because there's a lot of work in political science and sociology that shows that nonviolent campaigns to be successful really need broad cross-cutting support. So nonviolence is more popular, the movements are larger, this is the logic, and therefore they're more likely to succeed. And in fact, we have more and more evidence that shows that yes, when you compare nonviolent campaigns to violent or armed campaigns, nonviolence receives more public support. So the question, however, that this literature raised for myself, for some of my co-authors, is whether this is true across the board for all groups. And we find that, in fact, it is actually not the case. So to sort of summarize the figures here, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but basically what we find is that nonviolence is very effective for majority ethnic groups or for dominant ethnic groups. This might resonate with some of the themes that you have been hearing about the protests locally. This is true whether we look at dominant ethnic groups by size or by power. It doesn't necessarily have to be the size. That's the blue line you see over there. Their nonviolent campaigns are far more successful than violent campaigns. However, when we look at minority ethnic groups, excluded ethnic groups, we find that nonviolence does not have any contribution to their success at all. statistically. Now, does this mean that violence is more effective for these groups? The answer is no. You can see the orange line is fairly flat. Basically, nothing tends to work very much for these groups. But the point here for me is that they don't benefit from the nonviolent advantage that's been touted in the literature. In previous work, I'm going to not go into this in detail, but I'll just summarize that in previous work, we tried to explain why. And one mechanism that we identified is negative stereotyping. What we find, or well, not what we find, what is very well known is that there are deeply held prevalent stereotypes of minority ethnic groups as violent, as threatening, as hostile. And what we find in experiments in the United States and in Israel, so in Israel, we looked at Ethiopian Israelis and Palestinian Israelis, when engaged in the very same nonviolent resistance as white Jewish Israelis, they are seen as much more violent and as requiring more policing. We find the same in the United States when Black Americans engage in identical nonviolent resistance to white Americans, they're perceived as more violent and as requiring more policing. So these stereotypes pose real structural obstacles to the success of nonviolent resistance by ethnic minorities, because they essentially, in some ways, you might think of it as embodying violence. They are perceived as violence by their very being. And that's one reason for why we believe their campaigns are far less likely to succeed. Of course, there are other reasons. Minorities have less access to influence, resources, and networks. Their claims might come at the expense of majority groups. And of course, they're more likely to face more severe repression, which suppresses their dissent. So this is the starting point for the current paper, essentially that ethnic minorities have a very difficult time capitalizing on the nonviolent advantage. And what we ask is whether there's any way out of this bind, because we know that in some cases, there have been nonviolent campaigns by ethnic minorities that have been remarkably successful. And one can think of a variety of avenues that might increase the success for these groups. In this paper, we examine one, and that is the participation of majority group allies. And we ask, can majority allies, so committed participants from majority or advantage groups that are putting their voices and their bodies out there with resistors or protesters from ethnic minorities, can that mitigate negative stereotypes and increase their success? And if so, at what cost? So is there a cost to doing this to minorities and to minority movements? So what is the effect of allies on support for nonviolent resistance? We know very little. There's allies is now, I believe in 2022, it was named the word of the year in the United States. It's something that's been discussed a lot recently, but mostly in social science work examines why people become allies. So why would members of advantaged groups choose to work for and with disadvantaged groups? Whereas we're interested in the effects of allies. So while we don't know of any, or there isn't really any empirical literature, there are case studies of a variety of movements historically that highlight a tension between the positive effect of allies on the one hand and their potential costs. So what might some of the positive effects be? So we begin with majority audiences. So that means public opinion looking at minority movements with substantial presence of allies. They might counteract negative stereotypes. They might be more persuasive. White allies, oh, well, I say white because you're going to see in a minute, we'll look at Black Lives Matter, but majority allies might be more persuasive to majority audiences because we know that people tend to be more trusting of their in-groups. They might model that participation is accepted, that it's normative. There also might be a negative mechanism here. It might be that as more allies join a movement, majority audiences begin to feel that the movement is more palatable to them. And this might come out of paternalism or even racism. So I'm happy to see people from majorities resisting, but not minorities. If we move to minority audiences, so here too, there might be some positive effects of allies. First, as I said, they bring greater access to power, and that's a good thing. They may reduce expected risks of repression. Minorities know they're more likely to be repressed, so having members of majorities there with them might make it safer for them, and it might increase perceived efficacy and success. On the other hand, we know that the history of advantage group participation and disadvantage group resistance is fraught, often leading to many tensions in the movement. Sometimes there's disagreements over ideology. Allies are sometimes pushing towards being more moderate. They also can be perceived as less committed because they can always get up and leave, whereas the minorities are, stuck with these issues. And of course, concerns about co-optation or domination, meaning bringing the power relations in the real world into the movement. The case studies that I'm referring to talks about tensions among activists. We're looking at public opinion, but it's plausible that these tensions could spill over into public opinion. And this is especially true when allies take a leadership role. So to the extent that you have dominant allies at the forefront, being leaders, that might cause a lot of frustration and even harm the movement. So essentially what we expect is that as allies increase in a particular movement, we expect majorities to support protest more, to perceive protesters as less violent, to expect less police use of force, to support less policing, and to be more likely to participate in these protests, to feel safe at such protests. To put this briefly, this will have a positive effect on majorities. For minorities, our expectations are a little more complicated. We think that as the proportion of allies rises, minorities should be more likely to participate. But once allies take over the movement, or once they become dominant, that might actually alienate and lead them to participate less. We also anticipate that as the proportion of allies increases, minorities will expect less police use of force. And finally, we don't expect minorities to really change their opinions of the movement or of the protesters because of the allies. Okay, so this is what we call the front end, or the theory part in social science, and I'll move to the empirics. So the context of our study is Black Lives Matter, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And in the summer of 2020, protesters filled the streets of the United States in what became the largest and broadest protests in US history. What was notable about these protests is that the very significant participation of white protesters. There were Black Lives Matter protests in small towns across America that had no Black residents. This was something that was greeted in the media by some as a very hopeful development, whereas others were a lot more skeptical. And this allows us to see how those white allies affected attitudes in broader public opinion. And we do this in two main ways. We did a survey experiment in the United States, which I'll explain in a minute to the best of my ability. We also analyzed hundreds of thousands of tweets on Twitter to see whether images of Black Lives Matter protests that had more white people in them received more engagement on Twitter. I hope that makes sense. And let's move on. So what did we do with the survey? We ran a survey, as I said, in the United States. Hopefully you can see here a little bit of what people saw on the right-hand side. We told them a story about a protest in Washington. It looks like a news article. Protesters made themselves heard in the nation's capital on Friday, but we experimentally manipulated the racial composition of the protest. There were 4 different possibilities, either an all-Black group, majority Black group, majority white group, or all-white group. So this means there are 4 versions of the survey floating around, and people who respond are randomly assigned one of them. So each respondent sees only one vignette with one racial composition. How did we tell people what the composition was? Well, first we just noted it. That's in the bold, you probably can't see, but we said demonstrators, some of whom were white, many of whom were white, nearly all of whom were white, etc. We also used distinctive names, Seth and Jamal. This is common in studies of race in the United States. We also used images to convey the information visually. In order for the images to be identical, other than race, These are actually not real people. Well, their bodies are real, but their faces are artificially generated. And this is so that we can hold everything constant. So this is for experimental purity, and only vary the race of the participants. I could talk more about any of these things, but I would like to reach the results. After reading the narrative, we asked respondents about different outcomes. So we asked them, how violent do you think this protest is from 0 to 10? How likely is the police to use force? To what extent do you support large-scale police presence? To what extent do you approve of the protest, et cetera, et cetera. And what we find first is we're looking at results for all of the United States samples. So this reflects public opinion in the United States. In fact, moving from an all-Black protest to a majority white protest, everything else is identical, as you could see, makes people think that the protests are less violent by 14%, reduces expectations of police use of force and support for policing, increases approval of protests. So people are reacting more positively to protests the more white people are in them. As I said, we had different expectations for Black respondents and white respondents. I will summarize and say that what I just described, which is that allies have a positive effect on public opinion, is true for white respondents. What happens when you look at Black respondents here? There's really only one significant outcome that we find, which is that Black respondents expect that when there are many white people in the protest, police is less likely to use force. They are correct, of course. Other than that, their attitudes towards the protest are not really affected by the presence of allies. But it's important to note that there's also no backlash. So if people thought that allies might be alienating, might make people not want to show up, we don't find that that's the case. That's our survey experiment. Let me quickly say something brief about Twitter before wrapping up. So survey experiments are nice, or experiments in general, because they allow us to do what social scientists love to do, and that's isolate a causal effect of something. But of course, this is fake, right? We told people a story, and we wanted to know what was happening in the real world. So we did something a little bit complicated, which I'll try to summarize. Basically, we downloaded all of the image-containing tweets with the hashtag Black Lives Matter, or BLM. That gives us nearly 3 million tweets, about 1.5 million images, because people are retweeting these images. And then we limited our data set to days of major protests in June and July of 2020. So we have 1 million images, which obviously we cannot by hand analyze. So we use machine learning algorithms to analyze these images. And we do 2 things with them. First, we ensure that they're actually protests and not, let's say, a selfie of a person or, a father and his son. After we have assembled from within our data a set of only protest images, we use, again, an automated face detection tool to classify these images based on their racial identity. So this algorithm can tell us the share of white participants or Black participants or Asian participants in the photo. Those photos where the algorithm can't tell because it's blurry or because it's people from the back, they don't make it into our data set. So ultimately, we have 313,000 tweets, around 52,000 images shared in those tweets. Why did we do all this? Because we can then see whether tweets with mostly whites have different engagement on, or images rather, with mostly whites have different engagement on Twitter than images with mostly Black protesters. And in fact, they do. So images with the majority of whites receive more engagement on every metric. They are more likely to be liked, so you can see here, more likely to be quoted, more likely to receive replies, and more than twice as likely to be retweeted. So when we see, or when people in the Twitter sphere are seeing images with many white respondents, these images are getting a lot more amplification. I don't have time to show the next analysis, but I will just tell you that we looked not only at how often they were being retweeted or liked, but also at the tone of engagement. So is it positive or negative? and the engagement with images with whites is more positive. So it's there's more of it and it's more positive. Here are some examples of images with majority white participants that are receiving a lot of amplification on Twitter. So once again, here you see that the presence of allies is leading in the real world to a lot more impact, engagement, amplification, and knowing what we know about how important the digital sphere is for social movements today. This is something that is worth being aware of. Okay, I'll skip this. I'll just say that we find that both Black respondents and white respondents are generally supportive of allies, but for different reasons. So white respondents tend to talk about allyship, and this is based on analysis of open-ended questions in our survey, as something that's intrinsically important. Solidarity, inside we all bleed red is kind of a typical quote, whereas you see that Black respondents are supportive of allies because they're very aware of the benefits that they're bringing. So here's an example of a quote. In all history, if white people were not involved, the events were not successful and ended with multiple arrests and the loss of life. So let me summarize. What we find is that sizable majority participation has a significant positive effect on public opinion. It reduces perceptions of protest or violence and support for protest policing, increases approval of and likelihood of participation in such protests among majorities. Images of protests containing more majority participants receive more engagement, and also engagement that's more positive in content in tone. We do not find any backlash to allies among minorities. Rather, we find support for allies, but largely for instrumental reasons. And to sum up, I am mindful of the literature on the tensions that allies bring with them. This issue is fraught and something that should be conducted with awareness, given potential costs to activists and their movements. At the same time, both scholars and activists should be aware that allyship is a powerful tool for confronting structural biases to minority nonviolent resistance. Thank you.